The Lord be with you. I've actually chosen a reading today from Wordsworth, from Intimations of Immortality. Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul that rises with us, our life's star, has had elsewhere its setting and cometh from afar. Not in entire forgetfulness, and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come from God, who is our home. Heaven lies about us in our infancy. Shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy, but he beholds the light, and whence it flows, he sees it in his joy. The youth, who daily further from the east must travel, still is nature's priest, and by the vision splendid is on his way attended. At length, the man perceives it die away and fade into the light of common day. A word inspired by God. What do you think is the number of the degrees of difference between the freezing point of water and the boiling point of water? Depends on the scale. If you're using good. If you're using centigrade, it's 100 degrees. 0 is freezing, 100 is boiling.
180 in Fahrenheit.
Fahrenheit, 180. You know, it goes from 32 degrees at freezing to 212 at boiling part. So it depends what scale you're using. If I asked you to put a number on the height of the pyramid in Giza, what number would you give me? Depends on the scale, exactly. If it was in feet, it would be a very big number. If it were cubits, cubit was the measure from the middle finger to the elbow, and it was the known measure of measurement. If you use cubits, it would be a smaller number than if you did it in feet. And if it were in meters, it would be a much smaller number than if you did it in cubits or feet. So it depends on the unit you're working with. How many stages are there in human growth, in the human lifespan? Depends on your scale. Absolutely depends on the scale you have to use. So from the very, very beginning, for hundreds of years, even before Jesus Christ, people began to notice that life seems to emerge in phases. The great philosopher Hippocrates, who lived about 600 years before Christ, noticed this as well. And particularly he noticed the biological differences from stage to stage of life. Maybe the pithiest of all is that a comedian said there was 2 stages to a process. A guy called Woody Allen. Yeah? Life's a bitch, and then you die. There's 2 stages. Okay. Yeah. So that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the stages of life, and I'm going to make 5 main points this morning. Firstly, I'm going to talk about what the poets have to say about it, and secondly, what psychology has to say about it. Thirdly, what religion has to say about it. Fourthly, what Jesus said about it. And then fifthly, I'm going to give you my own theory, my own synthesis of what I believe the stages are. So the first one, what does poetry say about the stages of life? And I'm just going to pick 2 of my favorite poets. And one of them I picked this morning, Wordsworth. Wordsworth wrote this poem between 1802 and 1804. He and Samuel Taylor Coleridge were very, very good buddies. And they played off each other a lot in their poetry. You know, they were kind of transcendentalists or romantics, and so they played off each other in the kind of poetry they wrote. So Wordsworth wrote this in 1802. And he says this is a part of a much, much bigger poem, Intimations of Immortality. But he suggests that the stages of life are 4. So that he says, not in utter nakedness and not in complete forgetfulness do we come from God who is our home, but trailing clouds of glory. Heaven surrounds us in our infancy. So the first stage, as far as Wordsworth is concerned, is that we come from heaven. We're not in forgetfulness, but trailing clouds of glory, and we're surrounded by heaven as infants. The next stage, he says, is boyhood. Now, by the time we become little boys or little girls, the prison shades begin to come in because we're being educated. You know, and we're told that this is all imaginary kind of stuff. So the prison begins to close in on the young boy or the young girl. Stage 3 is the youth. And he says, the youth who is traveling further and further from the east. East represents, the rising sun or consciousness or heaven. We're traveling further and further from the sun. But in moments of ecstasy, as youths, we still experience heaven or where we've come from. And then finally, the fourth stage, he says, is we become adults. And now our vision is faded. We become jaded in life. And that's the fourth stage, as far as Wordsworth is concerned. Now, I think he was borrowing from Shakespeare, who predated him. But Shakespeare suggests that life happens in 7 stages. And it's particularly in this beautiful play called As You Like It, that he says, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. We have our exits and our entrances, each one in its time, place, many parts, our acts being 7 ages. And he suggests that the 7 ages are the following. The first one, he said, is the infant, mewling and puking in his nurse's arms. Graphic image, beautiful. Any of you who patted a baby over your shoulder when you have a new shirt on you, understand what he's talking about. And then the second stage, he says, is the whining schoolboy creeping like snail unwillingly to school. And then great image. And the third stage, he says, is the lover, trying to grow a beard and writing, according to Shakespeare, atrocious poetry to his mistress. Trying to kind of seduce her with his poetry and his god-awful poetry. That's the third stage. The fourth stage is the soldier, full beard at this stage, quarrelsome and vexatious and wanting to prove himself in the mouth of the cannon, going off into battle. That's the fourth stage. And the fifth stage then is the pot-bellied justice who survived the war. He's come back, and he's full of wise saws and modern instances. And stage 6 is the pantalooned retiree with glasses on his nose and wearing clothes that don't fit him anymore in his shrank. Inside in all of these clothes that used to fit the musculature of his body, and now they're dangling off him. And then finally, number 7, he says, the final stage, kind of dementia, sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. Without, teeth are gone, they've all fallen out, vision is gone, and you can't taste any bloody thing, so everything is gone. So that's the 7th stage. So pretty tough. If you look into the poets, not a very pretty picture, according to them. So that's what poetry had to say about it. What about psychology? If you've ever studied any psychology, you've certainly come across a guy called Erik Erikson, particularly developmental psychology. And he talked about the psychosocial stages of our evolution. And he suggested that life unfolds in 8 great stages. And the first one is from birth to about 18 months. And the choice here is going to be between trust and mistrust. Depending on how well the child is nurtured and loved and accommodated, the child will learn to trust the world or to be mistrustful of the world. So if the parenting is really, really bad and the environment is really bad, the child will learn, not to trust anybody. That's the great contest for the first, 18 months of our lives. And then ages 2 to 3, when we're being potty trained, we're learning to gain control over our own body and be independent. It's at this stage that kids begin to say, no, or mine. They're striving for autonomy or guilt. And so if they're really well treated during this stage, they have self-control and they feel really, really good about themselves. They have a sense of agency. But if it goes really, really badly, then they're really shamed. They feel really, really shameful. Ages 3 to 5 is the next one. And now a child is trying to gain some measure of control over his external environment. Firstly, it was control over her own body. Now it's control over the external environment. So the child will try to explore. So the choice then is between initiative versus guilt. So the child will be an explorer if left to her own devices. But if she's constantly told, no, don't do that, get off of that, come down those stairs, they begin to feel guilty. Everything they do is wrong, and they begin to shut down. From ages about 5 to 11, now the child is in school and the social relationships are opening up, and the choice is between industry or inferiority. If the child is in a situation where school is good and they're allowed to explore topics that are of interest to them and they're doing well in their peers, then they will be industrious. Otherwise, they have a sense of inferiority. I'm not as good as she is, or I'm not doing as well in my exams, or I'm not as good at football as this guy is, and we begin to feel inferior. From 12 to 19, we're expanding our social relationships. And now the choice is between identity versus role confusion, and particularly around sexuality and messages we're getting around sexuality. We either become, confused about who we are, professionally and gender-wise, or we've got a good sense of self. From 19 to 40 is kind of young adulthood. And now the choice is between intimacy and isolation. Now we've achieved maybe some significant relationships in our life. Maybe we've gotten married and we're totally beloved of somebody. And so we learn how to be intimate in relationship. Or else we're totally isolated. We're very, very poor at relationships. We feel like we're failures and we feel isolated. From age 40 to 65, the choice is between generativity or stagnation. Now the person is well established in their life. They have their kids raised, they're successful in the profession, or they're not, and they feel like they've stagnated, they're getting nowhere, they're moving into middle age at this stage, they've achieved nothing, maybe their marriage wasn't successful or whatever, and they begin to feel like they're stagnating. And then the final stage from 65 towards death, he suggested was between integrity versus despair. So we begin to look back at, on our life at this stage. I'm 68 at this stage. I look back and the question is, what have I accomplished? What have I done with my life? Have I made a difference in the world? Have I wasted my talents? Or, am I going to despair? I can't believe I've reached 68 and I haven't done a damn thing in my life. Is that what I'm going to do when I look back? So there are the kind of the choices. And they are the stages, according to Erik Erikson. So that's a little look at what psychology might say about the stages of life. The third point then, what do religions say about the stages of life? And obviously I can just only cherry pick one or two. I can just pick Hinduism and Roman Catholicism, very briefly. Hinduism is fascinated by the number 4. So when you study Hinduism, 4 comes up again and again and again and again. So this suggests that life goes through 4 stages. And the stages are the following: student, householder, forest dweller, and renunciate. And so they believe that for the first 20 years of your life, you apprentice yourself to some kind of a guru or a teacher. You attend to the teacher's needs. You maybe clean house for him, cook food for him, do his laundry or whatever, and he in turn teaches you about life. So the first 20 years, you're a student. Then at age 20, you get married, and now you're a householder. Now you're raising kids of your own, and that's your job for the next 20 years. Then at age 60, you probably become a grandparent. And now the job is to go inside and begin asking the deep, deep, deep existential questions. Why am I here? Who is my neighbor? What is my purpose? And so this becomes the forest dweller, somebody who goes off into the forest to ponder these deep existential questions. And then at age 60, the person comes back and they become the renunciate. They come back into the village in which they were one time landholders and important people, and now they're going around with their begging bowl, depending on society, to feed them. But they're bringing their wisdom as their gift to society. So Hinduism suggests they are the 4 great stages we go through. Roman Catholicism, as you know, talks about 7 great stages of the evolutionary trajectory, and they mark these stages with sacraments, rites of celebration for those passages of time. And the first one is around birth. We baptize newborn babies, so it's to kind of welcome them into the human community. So the first rite of passage, or the first stage, is the birth, the young infant. Around age 7, children typically in the Roman Catholic system will make their first confession. And so it's about the age 7. And this represents the fact that the child is now Homo sapiens, is a thinking being. They can differentiate between right and wrong. They can understand rules and they can understand roles. And so the sacrament of first confession represents that coming to reason, be able to think rationally. Around the same time, we're typically given our first communion. And first communion is a representation of the fact that you're now being kind of brought into communion with the entire Catholic family, 1.2 billion people right now, and also into the communion of saints, the belief system that the Catholic family is, partly on earth, partly in heaven, and partly in purgatory. And so the first communion is the induction into that communion of saints, as well as the community of the family of Christianity. Number 4 comes typically around age 12, and it's confirmation. And it's the time of puberty. We're becoming sexually mature at this stage. We're also developing the ability at this stage to be self-reflective. So now we are Homo sapiens sapiens. Not only can we think, but we can really think about thinking. we can kind of critique our own behavior, and we can critique the behavior of our culture and our church and our parents or whatsoever. And so that's represented by the sacrament of confirmation. In the early 20s, there are two possible sacraments. Marriage or matrimony, where people are now going to make a lifelong commitment of love to somebody, or ordination, where somebody's going to make a lifelong commitment to priesthood. And so it represents that transition into, where I'm going to dedicate the majority of my energy for the rest of my life. And then the seventh one would be a rite of passage. It used to be called the last rites, now called the anointing of the sick. And it's to help us in moving on the transition from incarnation to the other side. So that's what kind of religion had to say about it. When I look at the teaching of Jesus, I want to suggest that Jesus taught a three-stage model of it. And I want to preface this by saying there's a big difference between childlikeness and childishness. And there's a fallacy in psychology. There's a modern American philosopher, psychologist called Ken Wilber, and he created what he called the pre-trans fallacy. That we sometimes mix up pre-personal with transpersonal, or pre-rational with post-rational. And so sometimes we equate infants with avatars, and they're very, very different. Now, the infant is not an avatar. Had a lot of the same kinds of qualities, but an infant is pre-personal and pre-rational, whereas the avatar is post-personal or transpersonal and post-rational. But because neither of them are functioning mainly out of rationality, they sometimes get mixed up. So I'm not suggesting that Jesus is making this mix up, but he's pointing out that there's a very big difference between childlikeness and childishness. So I'm going to suggest that Jesus teaches a three-stage model of stages of life. And the first one is the pre-personal child who is fully awake. And kids are fully awake. If you've been around little children, they're fully awake, absolutely awake to their environment, but they're pre-personal. The next stage of life, I think, is the fully personal and totally asleep adult, which is most of us. And then the third stage I would call the disciple or the avatar. And this is a person who's fully awake and transpersonal. So it comes from a pre-personal, fully awake baby to a personal, fully asleep adult to a transpersonal, fully awake disciple. That seems to be what Jesus is preaching. That's the progress. When you hear him, addressing his own disciples, that is the invitation to let go of the sleep, in which most of us, the soporific effects of education and culture, and to come fully awake. And he tells us that that process looks very much like what children are doing. But he's substituting childlikeness for mere childishness. So he says, unless you become like little children, you will never even enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, he's not talking about becoming childish. He's talking about becoming childlike. And there are four great qualities of the childlikeness that seems to me to be common to the avatar. And those are, the first one is a sense of awe. And there's a phrase in the Hebrew Scriptures which is constantly misunderstood, where it says, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. The problem is that the word that's translated as fear is not fear, it is awe. So fear is not the beginning of wisdom, awe is the beginning of wisdom. So if we're trembling, cowardly in front of the divine, we haven't understood who God is. If we're filled with awe in the presence of God, then we have understood who God is. So the first quality of children is that they're filled with awe. Everything is a source of amazement to little children. That's why their eyes are so big. They're drinking in all this information. And Christ says that's how you must become. That's the first quality of childlikeness and of being a disciple, is to be filled with awe. The second one is to ask the right kinds of questions. Kids know that the emperor has no clothes. How many times, you parents, have you been embarrassed by a child, a 2 or 3-year-old child, making some social commentary, which, holy shit, come home already. But they're saying what they see, and what they see is real. But you're embarrassed because you're not supposed to see these things or notice these kinds of things. So kids call it like it is. They see it and they say it when the emperor is naked. The rest of us pretend like he's in this fine rig-out. Yeah? So kids have this extraordinary ability to be filled with awe and to see what really is, and then to ask the important questions. And I've shared this with you before. Kids ask really, really, really important questions, and the most important ones they ask typically draw kind of pitiful kinds of laughter from us. I've shared this story with you. Growing up with my grandparents, the first 6 years of my life, I lived with my grandparents. And all of my aunts and uncles were there. My father was the firstborn of his family. And I had an uncle who was 2 months younger than me. He was the last born of that family. So I had 9 aunts and uncles. And my grandparents and my great-grandparents lived with us. A big, big household. And we'd sit around the table in the evening, and the conversation was great. And so this was 1946. I was born in 1946. So about 1950 or so, I'd hear them talking about the war. And it was never called World War II, it was just called the war. And I hear the word the war, the war, the war. So at one stage, I pipe up in the middle of the dinner, and I said to my grandmother, whom I called Big Mammy, Big Mammy, how long did the war last? And I'm thinking she's going to say, well, it started at 11:30 in the morning and went right on until 7 p.m. And she says, about 6 years. I said, what? How could a war go on for 6 years? What happened when it got dark? And everybody exploded into laughter. It didn't make any sense to me that people could be killing each other when it was dark. And then I said, and what happened when they had to go to the toilet? How could you be making war when you had to go to the toilet? And then the clincher was, what happened when they had to go to Mass on Sunday? And everybody cracked up with this, question. It didn't make any sense to me that people could, miss Mass and kill each other instead. But these are the real kinds of questions. These are the questions that kids asked, and parents kind of laughed and thought, how funny and how innocent and how naive. That's the second characteristic that Christ noticed. The third characteristic was that kids are born without any kind of prejudice. They have to be taught prejudice. And the most glaring example for me happened in the last mission I was in Kenya. It was a place called Kipsarman, a very, very remote area. And we had a big compound there. We had a little hospital, we had a kindergarten, we had a school, an agricultural institute, church, mission, convent. It was a big compound. But one day this woman came on the compound, obviously schizophrenic, naked, absolutely obese. Nobody knew where she came from. She stayed around for about 4 or 5 days, and then she disappeared, and nobody knew where she went. So for 4 or 5 days, I'm trying to feed her. And she was nursing this 6-month-old baby boy. And I would sometimes just watch her. And there she is, sitting under a tree, absolutely obese, filthy, hair matted, and the baby is suckling at her breast. And as babies do when they're nursing on their mother, he's kind of fingering her face, the contours of his mother's face. Totally in love with this woman. As far as he's concerned, this woman is God. And indeed she was. She provided him with everything he needed. He couldn't see that she was schizophrenic. He couldn't see that she was filthy. He couldn't see that she was obese. But at age 4 or 5 or 6, somebody's going to point out all these things to him. And then he's going to see her very, very differently. But right now, what he sees is his mother, he sees God. And so kids have to be taught how to be prejudiced. That's a characteristic that Christ sees in children. That's part of being a disciple. That's part of being an avatar. And the fourth great quality is kids have an extraordinary penchant for forgiveness. Kids will forgive all kinds of abuse to which they're subjected. The most grievous example of this I saw was shortly after I came to this country. I was staying with a friend of mine down in Encinitas, and the morning newspaper came, the San Diego Tribune or something like that, and there's a photograph on the front cover of a CPS agent, a child protective agent, a big buxom woman who's taking a child from a mother who'd been abusing the child. And the child's body is covered with cigarette butts. She had stubbed out her cigarette butts on the child's body. And so somebody reported, obviously, and now the child has been taken away from the mother. And again, it looked like it was about maybe an 8-month-old boy. And he's desperately hanging over this woman's shoulders, trying to get back to his mother. He wants to go back to his mother, this woman who's abused him since he was born. But the child could forgive and forgive and forgive and forgive. So these are the 4 great characteristics that Christ spotted. So when Christ is talking about the stages of life, that's what I see. That we start off, as innocent little children with this extraordinary sense of awe, this great curiosity, ability to ask great questions, no prejudice, and totally forgiving. But then we're put to sleep by the school system or by the cultural system, and we close down as adults. So now we're personal, but we're asleep. And the third stage then is we become disciples or we become avatars, and then we're transpersonal and fully awake. So there's what I see Christ saying. My own kind of synthesis then is that I'm going to give 2 models, one a very simple model and one a more complicated model. So the first model I believe is this, that All of us are born in total innocence. Trailing clouds of glory do we come from God who is our home. Heaven sits around us in our infancy. That's the first stage. We're innocent, who look at life with love and curiosity, no kind of prejudice whatsoever. At some stage around maybe early teens, maybe 10, 11, 12, that innocence, that original innocence bifurcates. And it becomes either naivete, which is age-inappropriate innocence, or it becomes idealism, where we want to make a difference in the world, in our profession or in our relationships. And that sustains us for maybe another 20 years. And at some stage in our 30s, perhaps our 40s, the idealism bifurcates further. And it either becomes cynicism and bitterness, or it becomes wisdom and compassion. And it's a choice, event by event, relationship by relationship. And so we go from, native innocence originally to wisdom through the experiences we generate, as long as they're filtered always through the lens of compassion. So if we have the ability to filter every life experience through the lens of compassion, we find ourselves finally wise, loving elders. If we don't, what happens is we become disgruntled, bitter, cynical old people. So that's a very kind of a simple model. A more complicated model then is the following. I want to suggest that there are 18 stages to life. And I call them the 18 sacraments. And the first one happens long before we're born. It's the decision of the soul to volunteer for incarnation. That's the first stage of life, and it's the first great sacrament, a decision to volunteer for incarnation. The second sacrament and the second great stage is the merging of the soul with the fetus or the embryo. And the soul can come in at any stage of the pregnancy as far as I'm concerned. But now the second great sacrament is that the soul is now merging with the fetus, the developing fetus, or the developing embryo. The third stage is birth, and the first breath particularly. And in many, many different languages, breath and life and spirit are the same word. So the first breath we take, as we're born, that is the third stage, or is the third sacrament. The fourth sacrament for me, the fourth stage, is the evolution and the emergence of the ego, which happens typically around the age of 8 months. It's the first time that the child has a sense of separate self. For the first 8 months, it's in the oceanic bliss of the mother-child complex. It cannot differentiate between self and mother. It's just one being. Now it begins to differentiate out as a separate sense of self. So that's number 4, the emergence and the sacrament of the ego. Number 5 for me then becomes, when the child begins to stand upright and begin to walk. Now in some senses, it's now homo erectus. That will be the 5th sacrament or the 5th stage. The child is now erect and able to perambulate. Stage 6 would be learning to speak, putting words together and putting concepts together for the first time. That would be the 6th stage or the 6th sacrament. Number 7 for me would be coming to the age of reason, around the age 7, when a child is able to discriminate between right and wrong, when it's able to learn rules and learn roles. And now, indeed, it is Homo sapiens, not merely Homo erectus. Stage 8 for me would probably be puberty. A child is developing, At this stage as well, the stage 9 follows very quickly on this, and it is the ability to think self-reflectively. And so it's now become Homo sapiens sapiens, wise person, that they can reflect and critique their own performance and the performance of their culture. Number 10 would be the first kind of significant social relationship, falling in love with another boy or another girl or whatever. Be stage 10 or sacrament 10. Number 11 for me is the first committed long-term relationship where you sign up for a relationship that you're going to remain faithful to and committed to during life. The next stage, or the next sacrament, 12 for me, would be the profession that you adopt. The way in which you're going to try to make a difference in the world. And it's not just about earning a living, that's fine too. It's not just about getting money to pay the mortgage or buy a car, but it's about what difference do I want to make? What contribution do I want to make to the world? How do I want to leave the world differently than how I found it? Number 13 then would be ethnocentricity. The ability to think on behalf of my tribe or my nation. That I'm not just about self, I'm not just about family, I'm about thinking about the good of my entire nation. Number 14 would be going beyond ethnocentricity into world-centric thinking. realizing that all human beings of whatever class or colour or creed are equally my brother and my sister. And going beyond national boundaries and national security identities, or beyond religious affiliation, into the realization that we're all brother and sister. 15 for me would be the embrace of all sentient beings, that wherever there is life in the universe, those two are brother and sister to me. So that I'm not just, my identity is not even anymore the identity of my planet. It's the identity of all sentient life forms, wherever they are, in whatever part of the universe or in whatever kinds of dimensions. That'd be 15. 16 for me then would be the arrival at some kind of enlightenment, that I fully understand for the first time ever who I really am, who my neighbour is, and what my purpose has been. Number 17 would be the bodhisattva vow, the decision, even if you're an enlightened being, to keep coming back for the sake of those who are still asleep, the people who are still lulled into kind of soporific effects by the culture or by religion or whatever. And then the number 18, and the final one, will be the sacrament of reincarnation, a decision to keep coming back into this extraordinary dance. And the image that came to me this morning as I was thinking about this was, I see the sun, I see the planets in our solar system orbiting around the sun, but they're not going around in circles because the sun is moving. And so if you were to draw a map of it, it would be a dance in which the sun is inviting us into a spiral movement following its progress. And so the sun is like the soul, and the lifetimes we live, the incarnation, are like the planets that dance spirally through incarnation about the process of becoming avatars.